Hello everyone, today another question and answer video, by the way, is a follow-up, that is to say a response and question to a previous question and answer video from the same user from the last episode of the question and answer series about the ethnic identity in the Middle Ages and Antiquity. I found that question stimulating, so basically I say the person who posed me the question in private email watched the video and further responded. And I will not read, as usual, the entire question at the beginning, because this video is going probably to be quite long by itself. Also the questions, because this is like in the last one, a lot of questions to unpack about different peoples, countries, eras, etc. So it's not easy at all. Like every question would deserve to be properly answered, like an entire video on its own. But this is also maybe a strategy, right? Depending on what you really want. Just know that, of course, the question and answer video series is open there. I don't answer literally everybody. It depends on sort of the validity of the question and or pure arbitrium, because other things are happening in the cosmos that I need to take care of. And so there is always maybe some other videos. These videos actually are quite useful because they help me also varying a bit, of course, addressing the audience's curiosities, as long as they're evidently, like in this case, is pertinent, more or less the topics that we discuss. And also, like I don't have to prepare the usual videos. I have other times for refining the others, and I think there is also a more natural approach to this. It's just like a conversation. But without much further ado, let's get to the question that, again, I will read and answer step by step, because this time this is pretty long. Last time I simply read it the first time I was making the video, knowing what it was mostly about at large. Now I read it carefully to know what it's in it, so that I can simply address it step by step without reading it first, which may also be more engaging. So I will not say the name of the person here. Maybe he's indifferent to that, but if anything, you can let me know. Now, dear Schwerpunkt, thank you for your answer to my previous question on ethnic identity in the Middle Ages and Antiquity. I hope that you are eager to receive this message as a fan's reflection to your response. Of course, first, allow me to answer what I meant when I said to you, to quote, berate the idea that modern states are intrinsically entwined to an autochthonous population. This is a poor phrasing of what I meant. I simply stated it this way because I was eager to dive into the subject matter at hand. Sure, I understood that, of course, like some of these questions, I passed through my own phases of asking questions in the past, and I know how you want to condensate everything just to be to have it addressed, and then you have to adjust things depending on whether somebody answers you or not. So continuing, you see, ultranationalists and lay people believe that states have always been purely homogeneous societies that developed in an exclusive cultural vacuum. For example, a layperson might assume that Hungarians have existed in the Pannonian Basin as a self-conscious nation since antiquity. You've made numerous statements across your channel rejecting this type of idea, specifically at the 10-minute mark in your response to question and answer 38, why isn't Greco-Slavic civilization recognized? I should have also stated that I am the same person who asked this question, right? So that was interesting, because I didn't honestly remember that. I'm also not asserting that you have rejected the idea of national/ethnic consciousness in the Antiquity/Middle Ages. Your video on the Great Moravia mentions how there was a degree of shared consciousness within this Slavic polity. So yes, I understand. By the way, now I'm curious, because throughout the message I may assume that you are Hungarian, possibly yourself, even though this first part may be like you're a neighbor of the Hungarians, rather, but we'll explain now why that is the case. And definitely, I don't know how, let's say, yes, of course, there are ultra-nationalists who may make that point. In my opinion, like, it's mostly certain countries that I've met where people in general, not just ultra-nationalists for some reason, because most of the times these things are sort of ingrained through sheer, like, they heard it from someone. It's not like they've been properly indoctrinated and or they're aware of the theory behind the stuff, right? But it's, there are many, say, we all know by having lived in the first decades of the internet, what are across, especially YouTube and it's similar, like all the countries where it's like we were here from 150 billion years, we were the same identical people whatsoever. Normally, also in other countries, like ultra-nationalists are like, they may be like that, but it's more like a vibe that I get from, in fact, you say also lay people in certain places. Thus, even though these people exist, I would, however, because there is a range of ideas that I conventionally don't address on Schwerpunkt, because it seems to me that they may be so self-evidently wrong that they do not even require to be necessarily debunked. So, Now, continuing with the question, at the end of your video, you seem to think my message was created to accuse you about your supposed denial of nations. It was not. My prior email was sent out of genuine curiosity and confusion about the subject matter. My tone of confusion was then misinterpreted as something antagonistic. Allow me to elaborate. Before I developed an enthusiasm for history, I too used to believe that nation-states were the default structure that governed the world. I never considered that kingdoms and empires in the Middle Ages were formed from various cultures. I would have even assumed my prior example about Hungary was true. This later took a turn when I learned about 19th century nationalism. I was illuminated to how societies actually operated before the era of the nation-state. You can see there how I was surprised to learn that the city, religion, and dynasty persisted as a state's primary identity, as opposed to its ethnicity. So regarding the first part, I didn't think I was more antagonistic in my answer than you in your question. If I point, I don't remember what I answered specifically about this, but my impression was rather something like, because of course, as tendentially like a right wing, say follow channel, I get paradoxically more criticism from the random conservative. In fact, like maybe an ultra-nationalist that says, "Oh my God, you're a leftist because you said," literally answering to your video. I did not allow to that comment, but it happens, right? They just, as you say, they literally heard that for their entire lives. They don't even understand that you can be against that and being even more right-wing than they are, right? And since on Reddit there were some people who basically phrased like a person that actually a follower of mine that was actually even sort of positively presenting me. Like he made the point. He also basically stated that I didn't, I didn't value nationalities at all, or the nation at all. And oddly enough, if you ask Grok on X about me, and as you know, Grok takes information from this random site, sites that talk in that case about the channel. Because I asked at some point myself, like, who is this channel? What is his belief? Because I'm very interested how people are in turn fascinated with my own ideology. And it turns out that it's that easy to spread misinformation. So mostly your question didn't come up much as antagonistic as such, but mostly like as if it was continuing on the wake of that misinterpretation that happened in the past. And so without extra information like the one you provided here, I could equivocate. Also because, honestly, your question struck me mostly in the way you addressed the different types of people. Like as if for some people, like that idea of nation was sort of feebler than another, and sometimes even for more universal realities, in a stronger sense than in some kind of more regional ones. So it really depends. And it's interesting. Again, that's why I also think that you may be from Hungary yourself, because if you told me that you thought that was the case, I don't think that anyone who's not Hungarian would even pose themselves the problem. But this is not it's just an assumption of mine, may not be. So it's interesting, as you said also in the previous message, that you discovered at some point and that you were amazed. I think that was the thing that about 19th century nationalism and how fundamentally, yes, that there is essentially a moment of disgregation of, in fact, the traditional corporative hierarchical concept of of a nation into the generation of the nation for the sake of itself, rather than something more unitary, at least looking at especially the historical course of the events. Because frankly, I will make, by the way, traditional history videos about the nation, which in a sense can be sublimated. If you think about, for example, well, this is contentious, I'm not going to spoiler that either, otherwise we will not have any time here to answer everything. But the notion is that certain nations had made it to a degree of higher metaphysical value because of their achievements, like the Roman one being definitely one of them, even though, for example, I expect you may comment on saying, but the Romans actually had lots of peoples living under them that had a Roman citizenship. That's why I don't want to digress on that, but in a sense, I will answer through the events, through the examples that you provide, because they're actually pretty similar in that fashion. So going on, I would just say, by the way, that saying, you can see how then I was surprised to learn that the city, religion, and dynasty persisted as a state's primary identity as opposed to its ethnicity. I wouldn't say here oppose may mean oppose in the sense except to aiding ethnicity together with them, to which you would give often like a tertiary notion. If the tertiary notion is things as we will see now, like the Holy Roman Empire, where in fact the term Germanic appeared just in the end later on, that could, because I said it wasn't correct, like in that sense of tertiary sense. I don't remember what it was about France. In that sense, I would have a problem, because the Kingdom of France, you see, we'll come back on this now, was specifically the Kingdom of France, right? So it wasn't much just about a dynasty per se, but it had an important national connotation. And so again, we'll get to that. So going on with the question, but even as I became more historically aware, one question still lingered. If this idea is true, why do so many primary sources explicitly reference the ethnic identity of medieval and ancient polities? So I would also premise that some of this stuff you already asked and I did address. I know that my videos are big and that just, I think your questions match that scale in general, so it may be difficult to find all the the references to every specific question was posed, but after all, you asked for this, and I have my way of explaining. But comprehensively, that's something that, in a sense, I explained. For example, you go on here and says, regarding the Achaemenid Empire, once heard that the Persians were portrayed as merely one among many people subject to the Achaemenid dynasty rather than as an exalted race within the empire. There is clearly a degree of truth to both, but how important was Persian identity really? If it really was true that ethnic consciousness didn't exist in the ancient world, why do primary sources acknowledge a polity's ethnic identity? Essentially, it was clear to me that ancient states were primarily identified by their faith, dynasty, and universalism, yet there was still clearly an ethnic element to it all. My question posed to you was to find the balance between these two ideas and discover how truly relevant ethnic identity was to ancient medieval polities. This is exactly what I meant. I mean, the previous answer did actually provide with that answer. As I understand it, ethnic consciousness certainly existed, but played a secondary/tertiary roles to the attributes mentioned prior, right? So faith, dynasty, and universalism, yes. And the question, I would say, not just we have... So for the Persian Empire, for example, the problem really with history, do you know from which time we actually get the most straightforward answer to this? The modern age. Because it's most that I think it never existed, but the one we conventionally known as the modern age is the period in which basically these specific elements were properly formalized in an institutional way that we also documentarily say we can historically document and be more or less sort of concrete about. And this is interesting because it's not the age of nationalism, but evidently in part like the concept of post-Westphalian. And in fact, the very end actually of that very sense of universalism from one side, for example, bring this even paradoxically more on the fore, right? We start paradoxically to be able to answer this in a more historically documented fashion when these things were no more, right? For example, about the Achaemenids, just to conclude that chapter that is not part of the actual questions that you're providing me below. Let's say the fact that, for example, on at Persepolis, right, at the monument to the kings of kings, like the Persians are showed top left, together with our other essentially Iranian peoples that were considered, they're above other peoples that are like, I don't know, the Arabs or others that have been conquered by these Iranians. And so there, for example, you see the Persians as the most important, but still at some kind of the same level, like in a script, compared to other Iranian groups that were attributed a sense of nobility due to the fact that more or less the Achaemenids were about that Aryan ancestry. That in fact is also a bit the same one with the Iranian one, because sometimes the problem lays in the terminology as well, right? Iran means Aryan, for example, and so also Persian derives from another root, and yet when you look, for example, at royal identity and propaganda, you can say that the Achaemenid kings were also for political reasons. Remember, this is about the estates that speak and that document, that provide with sources. Obviously, as I said also in the previous video, an emperor would more typically stress a more, in fact, universalistic, sort of absolutely divine and dynastic sense of leadership. And as you recognize, it was like a mix of both things. Like from one side, say the nation could not be eliminated, right? Darius I, for example, emphasized his Persian and Aryan heritage in his inscriptions, like the Beistun one. And other Achaemenid kings did the same. So it was important to present himself as part of a Persian lineage, because at the end of the day, the Persians ruled as an hegemonic people over the other peoples, right? This in a political and strategic sense is undeniable, right? Persians often held key positions in the empires as satrapies, right, as governors. They were frequently Persians, right, coming from core regions like Persis, the modern Fars, right? There was a cultural dominance. The old Persian cuneiform and Zoroastrian influence practices are basically just citing the Elamite and Akkadian administrative traditions, because the latter were sort of more stately developed, but the idea that the conquerors of the north had taken over these other peoples was still pretty powerful. And when you look at the Persian elite, including the immortals, I also made videos about the Achaemenid army, they were predominantly ethnic Persians, right? Persian troops often formed the core of the royal army, and especially so in qualitative terms, right? So that also in the Roman army, like half were allies, but the other were full Roman citizens that had achieved that level of highness. And that, at the end of the day, regardless of the more cosmopolitic idea that we have of the Roman Empire, did come from a specific ethnic and also, at the beginning, a provincial background. Rome, Latium, the Latins were something among the Italic peoples that eventually formed the Romano-Italic Confederacy. That's a pretty solid national bulk that basically makes the empire, and that gets often overshadowed by the broader idea of everybody was mixed, as if, by the way, again, the empire had just sprang out from random people who didn't think to have a national identity. So actually for the Persians, I would really, like when you ask me, but how important was Persian identity really, given that there is clearly a degree of truth to both the fact that the nation was more or less important, I don't think there is a meter to evaluate that, but actually in a very strong, concrete sense, yes, this was a Persian empire in the sense that it was found and it kept going. It didn't even last too long, frankly. So the degree is a matter of debate in a broader sense, but let's say who lived in the Achaemenid Empire knew pretty well who was sort of the master in the picture. All right, it as always, it had a degree of decentralization, of localization, of provincialization of power, but this is something that transcends the mere ideology behind that. It's something that has to do properly how you can build an empire in antiquity, or at least in that particular time in history, like with the means of the time, which I think is also deeply connected with probably a Clausewitzian, a strategic culture, meaning that and a traditional one at the same time, because such enormous systems do not really stand together just because of now we are simply, sharing the sense of, okay, this is our leader now, or like this guy is severed from his national background. Of course, there are attempts to change, to shift. It depends. There are many influences involved, but in practice, just in order to control a territory, you must essentially have a bulk of a pretty cohesive people that has essentially a clear enough idea of the difference between them and the others, especially in as much as the fact that they are a warlike people that has also the civilizational tools to control the others. It can be often also more civilized peoples that at the end of the day keep ruling themselves administratively, but that also come to be very strongly influenced by the conquerors and those who really, in fact, enacted the conquest, which is something always entailing a hybrid. As I often say, like the most successful civilizations are essentially young ones. They're not necessarily just, the myth that, again, simply there are weak peoples that are taken over by barbarians that just per se are better. Like what we call as the barbarian is already someone who has the means, at least if he succeeds in doing so, because there are also the ones that destroy everything to the detriment of everybody involved, has the means already to be at the level of the conquered, right? I think this is especially the case for, I would say, the most successful empire in history, Rome's, right? So it's, and it's not so simple either, right? But it has really a lot to do with not merely a way people just style themselves, at least in the way we can historically document, because that often is just like a byproduct, right? It's more like what they have in mind and how they perceive themselves, which is naturally very difficult to simply reconstruct. One can say, for example, that the Persians tried historically, regardless also of their actual background, because think about different dynasties, different groups that entered further in the Iranian plateau, in also BC, AD, etc., how they tried to establish a Mesopotamian state, right? That obviously was based on a different ethnicity, but the actual center of the pool of national power of the Persians was always the Iranian plateau. So I would say that also that is also constant, that regardless, in fact, of the failed attempt, more often than not failed attempts of Persia to get anywhere out of those boundaries, like would essentially point to what kind of relatively defined national identity lays in there, regardless of the fact that also in the Iranian plateau there are different ethnicities, etc. But obviously the dominant one is the Persian one. So again, I don't know whether this question is, again, how important, like I would use this criterion. And it's also pretty much what I already said in the previous question, right? So there is no doubt that the nation itself was not central in the sense that, like in modern contemporary perspective, that was much more enhanced, but at the same time may have actually been more devaluated in absolute terms, meaning that the nation may have been actually much more important in antiquity in absolute terms, even when in fact faith, dynasty, and universalism were, especially from the top elite, especially in this case the Persians, as you know, were a very feudal country, so they had a very, again, warlike Indo-European sense of what, in fact, they were, I would say, adding like to the contrast of the other populations in ethos and motivation, etc. Than we imagine. In fact, again, nationalism is not much the actual way the nation was traditionally understood, and in fact it's a very emptied sense of how the nation was actually understood. It's just an increasing importance in relative terms, but in absolute terms, nationalists have no clue what it means to be part of a nation. And they are socialists at the end of the day as well, and vice versa to many extent. In any case, going on with the question, all in all, I appreciate the time you took to answer my questions. From the limited reading I've done, many experts typically gloss over this subject matter. True. This is actually possibly the most important thing, why I discuss this stuff, because I will not explain why this happens, but I think many people are kind of scared in the public to express certain ideas because they're somehow attracting strange reaction or maybe some accusation, etc. I don't care. It's not just that my persona is not out here. It's just that I really think that this is the most important aspect of history in a sense. Going on, so hearing you address these questions makes me feel as though I can breathe for the first time. Well, I'm glad to hear that. After hearing your take on my previous Q&A, I'm interested in, this is what the person writes, in how you view the remaining politics I have in mind, some of which I add, by the way, we already discussed. In any case, if you're willing to entertain me again, I have yet another list I would like you to dissect. Sure, let's go at it. Or if you feel the need to reject my message as a whole because you feel you have already answered everything adequately, I will take no offense to this. Again, some of it I think I've done. Adequately is never 100%. We're not God. But we try. Continuing, your previous enthusiasm also surprised me, as I thought you would be bored by this subject matter. In previous videos, you seem to stress that you're a military history channel, so I thought twice before asking about more anthropology content. This is actually the best content in terms of views making. It doesn't actually dilute my military historical one because, as I've just described in a sort of strategic sense, it does pertain very much to the most intimate nature of politics at the end of the day. So again, I noticed that people are interested in these topics, just like this question proves, but how, again, also in the analytics, I realized that I make more views, I make more subscriptions, etc. through that, right? So let's pass to actually 9 questions that I don't know how I'm going to end this evening. The Kievan Rus. What exactly was this place? Western Europe had the benefit of the Roman model, which the Germanic tribes adopted. There seemed to be a framework, a skeleton of civilization to build off of, but in Eastern Central Europe, nothing. The bedrock of this polity appeared to be Slavic/Norse trade posts near rivers, which were eventually conquered and consolidated into a loose state. But then lies the question, how did ethnic identity evolve in the Kievan Rus? I understand there are no sources which detail this transformation. This is particularly true compared, of course, to other places, which goes for this entire subject matter. But I have always been enthralled by how the Slavs were able to assimilate populations which lorded over them militarily. So this aspect is debatable in the sense that the Slavs always maintained the upper hand, at least in terms of direct rule in the sedentary world, in the world of the forest, especially in Eastern Europe, so to say. And say the nomadic world had, say, held sway just for a while, never fully actually settled in the Slavic world. As you know, Kiev was basically the frontier city with the best position, and even in that, the Khazars couldn't even quite simply go beyond, right? And this is, of course, a matter of balance due to the fact that the Slavs had quite gradually expanded, and also from relatively recent time, especially in Eastern Europe, where resources were scarce. So as you know, probably many videos about the various nomadic waves that at some point settle, but basically melt away. This actually connects with also the rest of the questions to a degree when you enter a bit like the steppe influence also in the rest, for example, more or less the Balkans, the Slavic world at large as well, right? So, yes, lorded over militarily, but up to just mostly in the in those centers where the same Slavs would actually become stronger and destroy, in that sense, the same Khazar Khaganate as the Kievan Rus achieved. And this could be extended because the notion is also due to some post-socialist biases that the Slavs were just a bunch of peasants who were lorded over. It wasn't quite frankly like that. Like, this is also the picture that was once put on the fore regarding the relation with the Varangians, the Norse, and we understand mostly that the Slavs were developing pretty much on their own. Also in the East, it was no doubt sort of the least at least developed place, not much, even just the less flourishing in many ways, because in fact, as we will see now, the settlement dynamics were quite sui generis, right? In fact, part of the reason why we do not really know too much about the Ruthenian ethnogenesis is that very much like the center of the system were these big citadels on the great Ruthenian rivers, and the countryside was also relatively detached from it. At least, first of all, we're talking about incredibly vast areas and also scarcely populated, etc. But in general, also the relations between these rulers and the locals are peculiar. It's not even just like we don't know them. So we could talk at length about this. I made lots of videos about the Kievan Rus, as a matter of fact, so that can basically help. So continuing with the question, among the common agrarian Slav, when did they see themselves as Rus? This is actually a very interesting question, and it's difficult to answer. I would say that as long as the elites began to at least assert enough power to be ostensibly recognized as the Kievan Rus, there was at least a sense of that identity. How fully like the majority of people began to recognize that is perhaps even influent in the sense that if they were successfully ruled, actually the system was very unstable. But to an extent it did work, especially in the 12th century, in the 11th century, was really promising in a way. You can argue that the decisive moral majority did identify, let's say, this space as essentially the one that we still today in terms of the Eastern Slavs. And that also points to the question of, in fact, how also like modern development can create nationalities that, let's say, separate from pools that you may not necessarily, in fact, even originally identify as clearly like one natio, to say it the Latin way, that eventually, in fact, take some steps that bring them somewhere else, right? So it's complicated because, as I was explaining in the previous video, nobody would, for example, like we live in a world in which, especially Eastern Europe, is very much debated, obviously, but it's just like, I don't know, why do we have an Austria if there was just a German nation? And today, nobody would say, well, but Austria is basically just useless or a fake state because it was a German nation. It doesn't make much sense. And in fact, that's where, let's say, the national identity also becomes malleable, but not necessarily, in fact, to the detriment of of power, right? And how things come into being. Then continuing, how did the Slavs of the Kievan Rus transition from subjects of a Viking elite to self-identifying members of a political community? And this again mostly took the path of the Rurikid dynasty, regardless of the genealogical ambiguities. This is a similar process to the one that happened in Poland, for example. In fact, these countries were very similar. Like our understanding of Eastern Europe, at least in a transnational space, because it's not just about, in fact, some important linguistical divide, originates in a deeper, in fact, cultural sense, mostly from the Mongol invasions onward, because otherwise the Rus was very close, even more to Western Europe than we realize in a practical sense than to the Byzantine Empire. And a few people recognize this, mostly, again, because the elites were adopting a very specific code of, let's say, of identity, so to say, mostly through Constantinople, etc. But in the practice, for example, the military one, they were very much influenced, and they had all the interests, but they were remaining sort of relatively in between, autonomous, etc. And the question goes on and says, so again, it's difficult to answer, first of all, like a self-identifying members of a broader political community. At some point, I would say that by, again, the recognition of overlordship, right, over, say, both Novgorod and Kiev at large, like the sense that the system was a wall and that was basically separated from the Poles from one side, the Turks from another, the Scandinavians and the Byzantines. I think this overall space was pretty well outlined, right? And just by also cultural proximity, linguistical proximity, you could approximate, in fact, that same identity. But it's not like the average Eastern Slav. We don't know exactly, in fact, how the average Eastern Slav would have simply thought about this in practice. Because, again, it's always a matter of estates. Who are these people? Who are they, right? So, continuing the question, among the warriors of a druzhina, I've read that anyone could join if they prove themselves to be capable warriors. With this in mind, how did Slavs and Norsemen get along with the druzhina? How rigid would the ethnic hierarchy have been? So this was, first of all, like a similar dynamic to the one that existed in Western Europe, right? And that's interesting because, as you know, at this point during the Crusades, for example, like you had a broader sense of belonging to the, say, Christendom and even the Latin Christendom at large, in a more consistent way, but there were national differences within these groups that were also well understood. The Vikings are a bit of a different story because they themselves were still essentially in the transition from some kind of tribal to more national profile. So it would have been, especially between Northern and Eastern Europe, there were not even so dramatically stratified places, in fact, like difficult differences to draw. The understanding is that the Norse seem to have been stronger, to have had the upper hand in the form of these essentially mercenary forces that were, however, also able to take over, right? And this is a dynamic that happened, for example, also in Scandinavia in later Middle Ages. There are some German mercenaries that take over Denmark at de facto from the top of the kingdom. So this mostly speaks, of course, naturally of the frailty of the Eastern European political institutions, but at the same time, we shouldn't simply just think that, again, that weren't powers that weren't able even to do practically like all on their own. Mostly the need to have some more robust leadership under a guy who could settle matters, especially internally, more than even like for external threats, and give this sort of super partes consensus doesn't quite necessarily, in fact, entail here like a national domination, right? It wasn't properly a moment in which the Scandinavians ruled over the Eastern Slavs, right? It was more like just foreign dynasties that kept happening, like in the rest of European history, backed by powerful military that, however, is still just single war bands or something more at some point, but that were also basically maintained and supplied by the same Slavic system. So bringing to a pretty quick assimilation of the same, by the way. So again, the video will be very long because there are lots of questions, but I would like to put it in this way. Like, in this sense, Northern Eastern Europe was faring sort of with a gear less compared to what you see in the Latin Germanic one in terms of political institution, but also national and social, cultural development, right? So, continuing, what was the impact of Christianity in the ethnic evolution of the Rus? Well, it was important because, as I said before, the elites mostly bought into that, quite obviously, like it happened also in other Slavic lands, to strengthen the local policies, right? Christianization equated to even just like better, but more, to a cooptation from the more civilized part of Europe and the erection of much sort of more solid infrastructural systems that would allow, in fact, one clan to basically emerge towards a monarchic direction. I made a video about how, for example, the Byzantines were relegated to evangelize most like the least developed parts of Europe and even beyond, compared to, in fact, the Roman papacy. And in this sense, you find that some of these policies were also less actually depending on the Byzantines. That's what I discussed, for example, in that video that I made because of your question, why wasn't the Greco-Slavic civilization as advanced? Exactly, because in many ways it didn't even develop a truly cohesive ecclesiastical system like the Roman one, right? It was in many ways like a tool to, again, for the local powers to strengthen, but it's not like the Byzantines came to dictate like the general ecclesiastical policy of the Ruthenians. In fact, at a point, they also were pretty much on their own, even in their relation with the papacy. This is an underappreciated aspect, given that the next question revolves around Bulgaria. The First Empire did at some point actually wink at the papacy, and it could have been possible for it to just be, to pass to Romanity, in theory, just like, however, also the Croats had done, etc. And actually, like, the Croats were always Roman Catholic ever since they were Christianized. But in that sense, there was a frontier and ambiguity, and things could change. So finally, what was the core of the state's identity? Was it the dynasty, the city of Kiev, its Norseness, its Slavness? This is the point. Like, when you look at this stuff, you realize that they are all one with one another, including nationality. Right? Hadn't there been a recognizably ethno-cultural, linguistic humus, so to say, that made the thing appear for different political or strategic reasons as like a polity could effectively rule over this wall, even just nominally to an extent for the system to hold, there you start having a nation, the elements of which are surely already pre-existent, so you can always see that, embryonally speaking. And as I was saying before, also this system eventually got to break down, so that this vast region didn't turn out to be like a single national reality as many others. Also, more developed parts of Europe, in many ways, also because of that, right? It's difficult not to look at Russia, for example, and realizing that the way it was sort of put together is a bit hasty in a national perspective, and this can be extended to the entire ambitions that also countries have over others that at some point make their stand to show that they can be a nation and they are thus a nation on their own, right? So I would say for the Kievan Rus, probably the most important thing, at least foundationally, was the Rurikid dynasty. This is at least, again, what the establishment basically told us. The city of Kiev was important, but it's not like from Kiev they control literally everything. The system remained always pretty, scattered. And the Norseness was just like some sort of ethnic flavor in the establishment. The Slavness was a very strong component. But especially this enucleation of the Eastern Slavness also true. There are some geographical factors. As you know, I don't embrace the concept of geopolitics, but it's not to say that geography does not count, right? So this shows well enough how fluid the system really is. Then passing to the second question, the First and Second Bulgarian Empire. The First Bulgarian Empire was primarily a union of Bulgars and Slavs. I'm reading from the question, of course. It is always briefly stated how they eventually homogenized after the introduction of Christianity, but no one ever entails how this occurred. It appears that the Slavs played an important role as infantrymen in the Bulgar army. The archaeological site of Pliska also demonstrates a great amount of Slavic pit houses around where the Khan resided, but their influence is best exemplified by the consolidation of the Slavic liturgy as opposed to the Greek or even Bulgar one. So I ask once again, how did Slavs go from being subjects to the Bulgars, in this case, to self-identifying members of a political community? So in this case, by the way, they had truly been wholly, if you talk about Bulgaria as a whole, and so also Slavic peoples that, by the way, would have not really had necessarily, in fact, a national cohesion at all in the area. It was also relatively complex and extended, and did not even include Slavs, of course, and nor just Turks and Slavs. The reason why the liturgy is important, of course, is that the moment of statal formation, as I just stated, through the evangelization, the establishment of a church, and the equal development, in fact, of a lay that was still conceptually sacred polity, would be obvious, at least in the sense that by that point the Slavs had been sort of preponderant compared to the Bulgars, to the point that the latter couldn't quite simply, in fact, Bulgarize them, right? Turcify them. It's a bit like the Germans with the Romans, right? It's not like it could simply come to rule in issuing laws in Germanic. Without mentioning, by the way, that some of these areas had previously been part of the Roman Empire, differently from Eastern Europe. So it's not they weren't necessarily, well, they were more developed technically, but there wasn't even actually an abyss between them. And again, the territory is pretty extended because the first Bulgarian Empire, about which I made multiple videos, of course, stretched, at least nominally in dominion, pretty far and wide, including the Carpathians even. And there are all the Romanians that will hate me for saying this, or at least it was in fact a decentralized rule, and there was all a level, of course, of idealism about that for sure, but still existed at the same time. So in this sense, because after the following question is, in the sense, unsurprisingly about Hungary, right? And how didn't, in fact, the author of the question asked, why did Hungary maintain basically its Magyar tongue and, in fact, non-Slavic ethnic identity as a nation? Well, say they had probably more foreigners coming to rule over, which you can't say about Bulgaria, right? Bulgaria was, at least the area, we talked recently about the Thracians, etc., was, yes, ravaged by a consistent amount of peoples up there, but say the settlement of a single polity from nowhere in what would become Bulgaria happens just because of the Bulgars. There aren't other peoples that, if not in smaller chunks, in fact, enter, for example, the same Bulgarian orbit, or as we'll see now, also the Second Empire emerge from the nearby areas, also in a moment of great political disgregation of the same, in fact, empire. So I would say that, at the root of it, these Slavs were prevalent in Bulgaria, and probably they played just also a bit more important role than just infantrymen. That's a bit the stereotype, because the Slavs at large I made multiple videos about their warfare. They were actually very clever, but because they were also very pressed, given their quite primitive and generally poor situation. But as I was saying before, we shouldn't push much the sort of the Stalinist picture of the Slavs. There were elites, there were cavalrymen, and so when you look at the first Bulgarian Empire, at large, you realize that even though the Bulgars were the master race, so to say, they had also immediately began to blend with the Slavic majority to a degree that, for whichever demographic reason, that at least is self-evident in the broader scale, but we don't even know precisely the numbers of brought to that melange by the time this area was to be organized into a broader. And by the way, the Byzantines are also very close, so making leverage, for example, on the Slavic element to contain a bit more like the same, by this point, Bulgarian elites that are already, again, blended with the Slavs, it's sort of from the Bulgar, Turkic, and not entirely even Turkic background would be a mean to an end. This country was developing in a very uniquely odd way that is technically within the Byzantine Empire, but also not quite at the same time. And so it's indeed a world on its own, because especially the Byzantines, as we've seen, are mostly like an Aegean civilization. So even the Balkan hinterland at a few tens of kilometers starts becoming very foreign to that in language, in culture, etc. But I would basically give this answer. So the question continues with, what were the differences and parallels between how the Slavs merged with the Bulgars and the Rus? Well, as we just observed, essentially the Rus evolved through a broader princely coordination of different grand princely coordination of smaller principalities that essentially recognized a principle of seniority. Again, this happened in Poland as well. And in this sense, the Varangian element had just mostly represented the muscles, like the elites, the sort of the picked forces, the more sort of advanced ones, as an elite of the military, but not outside of a de facto Slavic dominance. And even though, again, these dynasties installed themselves from this Norse background as well, everything was more blurred. And in fact, we know also relatively less, regardless of the fact that this is a process that happened later compared to Bulgaria, that had instead been literally invaded by a people that settled there and began to rule in their own name. So that's a very different thing, because also as far as, for example, the Khazars, as we said before, like the Eastern Slavs had not really ever been ruled over by a broader cohesive people, right? And if anything, they had, however, likely began to develop their own identity against that sense of otherness that the steppe, with all its sort of threats, represented, and also other divides that at some point were also relatively random, and or possibly, of course, having to do with pre-existing settlements, because again, here I'm not even going to descend into the fact that, of course, when we talk about the Slavs, we're talking about, yes, a specific group that for different reasons we came to identify and name like that, but that settled on previously inhabited areas that were still, in fact, maybe not plenty of people, but still, populated enough to in certain cases develop, in fact, certain even same Slavic principalities as such, because without that basis, it would have been difficult, for example, for, Serbia to even just exist as such, right? There are some broader preconditions that offer that in the place, but this, as we've seen, was probably a migration from Central to Southern Europe by a people that probably had also been hegemonized by some Iranian elites and that lived north of basically today's Czechia, among the Sorbs that are technically the Sorabs that would have been connected with the Serbs in the south historically. And I made a video about the origins of the Serbs and about medieval Serbia. Serbia will have to come back on that. So this is the main difference at large, that Bulgaria emerged as a state properly made by the Bulgars, as an external element that eventually got assimilated by the local majority. A bit like it happened, again, in very different ways, but with the Germans in the Romance countries. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, which are the bigger, most definitive ones, like Gaul, Italy, and Spain, right? England takes a while, and there is an answer, let's say a question and an answer, hopefully, about this later, because there are 9 questions again. So it's about all these different peoples that indeed are looking at sort of the most fragmented areas of Europe, because they make all this more complicatedly comparative to hopefully assess something more objective. Continuing with the second question. As for the identity of this state, talking about the first Bulgarian Empire, it seems that the Bulgars inherited the idea of becoming a universal polity from the Byzantines, with Preslav as a rival to Constantinople. But prior to this, they would have acknowledged their state as one belonging to the Bulgars, right? And this is exactly the point, meaning that the same Bulgar Empire, so Bulgarian later, was essentially elevated to imperial authority in their own view, and with a sort of cooptation from the Byzantines that were, of course, trying to keep them sort of below the same and within the same empire as subjects, which was bestowed upon, in fact, the Bulgarian rulers in virtue, of course, of what was the traditional recognition of power. So, as I've read correctly, it's not like the fact, because this is the core of the issue of this national thing. I think I had been relatively clear in the first video. Like, the nation is the one that wields the empire over other nations. This is what constitutively makes an empire. It's not a random title of universality bestowed upon, as it would have, however, happened, a specific leader. The specific leader was genetically tied to the nation and was meant also to irradiate this imperium, to elevate further this nation to an imperial degree. So it's not like in the moment in which the empire was conceived from a Byzantine imitation, because, by the way, this thing was already around. It's not like in the steppes they didn't know that there were universal empires that they sort of create for themselves in this very recognition, because more or less everybody tries to get that delegation. But this is the Bulgarian Empire. In the title of Bulgaria, doesn't become a Slavonia, right? It's Bulgaria, all right? And it will remain that, and it will remain as the Imperial Bulgaria. Then the question goes on. It says, on to the role of Vlachs in the Second Bulgarian Empire. Some say that the early sources refer to the ruler or state as the kingdom of Vlachs and Bulgarians. I would add the Cumans as well. That was the full title, at least in one source that defined them. However, it seems that the influence of the former, that is the Vlachs, especially from a grassroots perspective, would become negligible. Well, it's not like the Second Bulgarian Empire even was around too much, or at least in too much of a consistent way. And this is actually the problem, because, and that would be even more, apparently, I mean, the Cumans would be allegedly even more negligible. The point is that the Second Bulgarian Empire was basically a revival of not even the older power. Of course, there would be a degree of hopeful continuity in the intention of its rulers. But the nature of these powers would, in many ways, always predatory. We've seen it, that whoever inhabited the Balkans tended always to exploit the crisis in the civilized Romania, so to say, the Byzantine Empire, to raid and plunder. This is basically what the Bulgars and the Bulgarians and the Vlachs and the Cumans did throughout all these centuries, right? So this term Vlachs, Bulgarians, and Cumans, it's something that mostly denotes that aggregational, so to say, or congregational aim that these peoples had to raid the more fertile lands in the south, right? And that they couldn't even quite simply occupy, right? So the question says, what exactly was the extent of Vlach influence on the Second Bulgarian Empire? How did the ethnic consciousness of Vlachs shape the state, and why did it fade? I assume the Vlach brothers Peter and Asen realized they would have an easier time staging a rebellion using the framework of the Bulgarian Empire, as opposed to building a Vlach polity from scratch. Yes, and they could have not, in fact, properly imposed it. It's not like the Vlachs were so cohesive, in fact, to simply, render Bulgaria Vlach in turn. At the same time, as you know, that the Vlach distribution was sort of more scattered than we think. It's difficult sometimes to properly tell who were the Vlachs and how much themselves they would just, let's say, acknowledge one another. At least they were acknowledged in the later Middle Ages at this point by also within other systems like the Kingdom of Hungary, etc., proper from a juridical point of view, etc. So surely they could recognize one another, say, compared to a Slav or to a Magyar, right? But as we know, say when we look at the state, as we call it here, the Second Bulgarian Empire, again, made videos about that too. It's still a game of elites, basically, and so there you can even cosplay as different things depending on what you want to stress. You may have the support of this or that, and it's extremely complicated. The point is, I wouldn't just even look at the Second Bulgarian Empire and ask too much what kind of, what kind of state we're talking about. It seems too much, in fact, of a broader congregation of forces that started mostly from a Bulgarian basis, on the ruins of the First Bulgarian Empire. And I wouldn't go too far saying that, I don't know, like the Vlachs were specifically seen as, probably were still a fringe from a Bulgarian perspective, but there is no doubt that their military weight, as much as the Cuman one as well, was relevant enough, especially also for external observers to point out that there were pretty interesting things going on. And in fact, we know too few about this area, in spite of the later times, because it was too deteriorated as a state to be even institutionally recognizable and documentable. We don't even know what its official flag was, for example, things like that. And centers of power sort of, as you know, shifted. There were different noblemen rising up, and sometimes we don't even know what kind of ethnicity they were, and or what kind of, in that sense, following that they would have had. Surely the Bulgarians maintained the upper hand overall, but it's definitely a joint business with these other groups that have become more important for different reasons. The Cumans also in a more predatory fashion after the Mongolian invasions, the Vlachs, because also the later sort of revival. Actually, the population of the lowlands that allowed the Vlachs to descend from the mountains and to become more important. But they had always been there as well. So if anything, this shows that the system had become much more permeable, which goes well in parallel with the degree of sort of the generation of public authority, and at that point also in that specific part of Europe of a neatly outlined ethnic divide that is, at least especially even in a geographical sense, like we don't even have precise maps of where at the time who was who. Like we have a broader idea, but again, when we talk about war bands as well, considering who wielded power, that is also a relevant aspect. The Vlachs were very much, as you know, transhumant, right? Very much semi-nomadic, even in their lifestyle. The Cumans being nomadic as well, so it's complicated to say the least. And so, yes, there was no chance actually for the Vlachs to simply unhinge the Bulgarian national primacy, right? And not just because of the previous, the existence of the previous empire, right, before the 11th century, or before, that the events that happened in that century. Number 3, obviously, the Kingdom of Hungary. Now, despite their origins as a Uralic people, the Hungarians exhibited a certain degree of heterogeneity with Turco-Iranian influences. I imagine that the early Hungarian dominion was quite composite and abstract in terms of its ethnic consciousness. Furthermore, the Pannonian Slavs had been brutally tormented by the Avars and would surely have resisted any semblance of assimilation. Yet, in the end, the Magyar identity was the one that triumphed. Why? What did the Magyars do differently from the Avars? I suppose this has to do with the fact that the Slavs did not begin to assimilate with Magyars until after the sedentarization / christening of Hungary. But if this were true, why did the Slavic identity fade in Hungary as opposed to Bulgaria or the Rus? How did Hungary manage to homogenize its population? So my answer has always been that, as I hinted at before, essentially the Pannonian Basin had been invested by so many different peoples that had also properly taken root there. The Huns, the Avars, the Magyars, that the local populations had been sort of more diluted, had been had more difficult, let's say, to establish their own political identity. And in fact, yes, I made a video about the Pannonian Slavs that explained, in fact, how sort of feeble, generally speaking, their overall cohesion was. We know that they existed, but for example, in relation to Great Moravia, how did they fare? Were just like the main centers an offshoot of that? It's very difficult to understand. The most important reason, however, or at least one that would have surely played a major role in all this, is that the Pannonian Basin is actually steppe, right? Bulgaria is not steppe, right? The Eastern Europe up to the steppes that in fact remain Turkic, not Slavic, is not steppe. It's forest, right? Hungary, what would become Hungary, like the Pannonian Basin, is the westernmost steppe areas, and it's not even too small. So that actually, this is the reason why these nomadic peoples would actually settle there at some point, because they could continue to essentially live in their traditional way, to replicate their, for example, their predatory steppe warlord kind of dominion and territorial control. This naturally alienates from the core of this area other populations. It's not like to say that in the steppes, even in Central Asia, to say that weren't sedentaries that lived there in spite of the entire nomadic waves. However, they were, of course, just per se, because also the steppe does not properly provide with that, especially at the time, with that sustenance that can't really provide with this enormous sedentary system. They basically fall prey of this, and they tend to move to the outskirts. Also because, frankly, peoples, in fact, like the ours here, I appreciated the adverb brutally, because it's not like even the Magyars would have been so tender, nor the Huns had been. I mean, these were incredibly brutal, savage people. Like, it's not like they were savage in the sense that they weren't developed. The Magyars, but the others too, that they displayed. I appreciated the beginning of the question, especially when you point out that was some Turco-Iranian influence, but one of a civilized one, also from the Caliphate. For example, Hungary would maintain an important connection with the Middle East. We know that their polyurcetic practices date to, in fact, the context of this Ugraphenic migration throughout, like the north of the Caucasus, and so in contact with the Arabs, etc. So they weren't really underdeveloped, but they were really brutal, right? And their whole deal of lifestyle was, of course, not particularly friendly to, especially those who would have fallen into their immediate dominion, which evidently also did not really serve well, right? Because you wanted to maintain a nomadic army like the one that ravaged Europe during the 9th and the 10th century, to function on the same basis of the pastures, of the normal cattle breeding, and so how the various de facto oligarchs that were in fact all divided. There was a sense definitely of compositeness in there, as we know very well, also from the same Hungarian historiography and tradition of the originary group. This was completely normal. This was true also for the Bulgars at the beginning, right? But this doesn't mean that alliance, so to say, of these tribes wouldn't actually lead, in fact, just because of the metus hostilis of the steppe, in fact, to a more cohesive identity. By the way, the Magyars, being in fact Uralic, they weren't Turkic, they weren't Iranian proper, they had elements of that, as the question rightly points out. But this probably would have initially sort of informed the way they, in fact, identified themselves compared to the others. It probably played a role when they settled in Pannonian Basin too. But again, to make it a long story short, basically the Slavs tended to stay away from the steppe area of the Pannonian Basin and to entrench themselves on the foothills, like the Sudeten lands in the south, in fact, in the Balkan Mountains, etc. And in fact, these peoples would always kind of resist to majorization. To an extent, they did succeed. I mean, think about the Serbs, think about the Slovaks, right? At a point, some of these lands were even part, technically, of the Kingdom of Hungary, not even just a dependency of the Crown of Hungary. So they were really a bit like Transylvania, right? It was technically part of the kingdom. But of course, there were these foreigners who had to imperially rule. I would say that Hungary fits pretty much that imperial model because it was enormous and it controlled lots of different peoples that returns in the title of their kings later on. So it wasn't actually this overwhelmingly overarching system. It did not really behave as an empire conventionally meant. It was basically beaten by the Germanic one. The Magyars were so stunned by it, they decided to imitate in the conversion to, in fact, the Roman Church. They're different from the Byzantine Empire, that they don't raid there. They just exploited for a while. The Latin Germanic crisis followed to the end of the Carolingian Empire. So that is the reason why. Comparatively, if you ask that, Bulgaria didn't have that. Okay, Bulgaria had different waves in the north, especially the Balkans, through the Danubian corridor. But the only people who settled there and said, okay, this is ours, were the Bulgars. And pretty much nobody else, even though there were so many other groups, again, arriving, as we've seen there, with the Vlachs, the Cumans, etc. But that's not quite another people. The Pannonian Basin had three. Eastern Europe didn't have any, right? The Eastern European forest region is just, nobody went there. Of course, somebody would venture there, some daring Turk would try to create a seigneury somewhere over there. But even the Mongols, yes, tame these places, they subjugate them. It's not like they literally take over, they Mongolize, they start ruling with direct occupation. So that's the easy answer why, right? The Pannonian Basin was more like a steppe area, did not really favor, like also in antiquity, it was a military frontier. The Romans didn't really extrapolate much from that in terms of a sort of more sedentary, florid area. Like the only fertile land along the Danube was really Moesia. They also made a video on, which also, by the way, contributed to, for example, the better development of an agrarian society in Thrace, in Bulgaria, for as far as the Slavs were concerned during the migration era. So this is actually a fairly easy answer. Like, it may be complex, but it's not too sort of difficult to, in my opinion, to explain why Hungary remained like that. Then, of course, there are other processes later on down the Middle Ages that bring, of course, to, at that point, the Magyar identity is established, right? So I wouldn't even say this thing that the christening of the country brought to a greater amalgamation of the Magyars with the Slavs, at least to the degree that it would be simply because of that. Of course, it may have been easier as far as, some Slavs were already Christian, but in the surroundings, especially in the eastern part, like, it's sort of difficult to understand what was even happening to a degree, without mentioning that you can have some polities like the Lithuanians that will convert themselves just in the 14th century. And of course, there are in even less developed areas, but let's say Christianization does entail a step further in civilization, but it's not the unique indicator of how developed you are in certain instances, right? Because time passes civilizationally for many people involved. Question number 4, Habsburg Empire of Austria. Reading, I sense strong parallels between this polity and the Holy Roman Empire, a state that upheld dynastic and religious rule, yet maintained the German ethnos as a highly important but tertiary attribute. With this in mind, to what extent would the Austrians have upheld Germanness in parallel to the Holy Roman Empire? All right. So it says World War I propaganda posters seem to celebrate the ethnic diversity of the Austrian Empire, possibly to quell nationalist separatism. So how would German cultural hegemony be exerted in tandem with the volatile nature of nationalism? It seems that the Austrian Empire of the 19th century was cautious about acknowledging German hegemony to maintain social harmony. With nationalism on the rise, did the ruling nobility view the exaltation of a Germanic ethnic core as something contrary to religious, universal, and dynastic rule? Of how would the nobility have viewed the Germans as an ethnic core in the centuries preceding nationalism? How did this change as time went on? So this is interesting because even though the beginning seems like we're talking just about properly like the post-secularization, properly after the end of the Holy Roman Empire, the latter part seems to obviously ask in like what happened before. So in general, Germanness, say, I made multiple videos, first of all, about the Habsburgic Empire and its foundations, and there wasn't, let's say, much to uphold just per se. I mean, the Austrians were Germans. They had belonged at least to the Kingdom of Germany, and in, say, starting from the Renaissance in particular, they start sedimenting ever more what looks like, even with its own feudal shortcomings, a more national reality that is definitely ruled by the Germans at large. That's at least the part that manages to keep down and or to coexist with, say, the Bohemians, the Hungarians, etc. And so, given that they were also, I mean, the Habsburgic dynasty was also the Holy Roman Imperial dynasty at large, with a fragmented Germany, and for a while no other essential contendant for a broader purpose of German unification. The Germanness of the, because here the title is the Habsburg Empire of Austria. They saw it themselves, of course, in mostly in a dynastic sense. We are lords that rule over these peoples, and we happen to be German. We are native of the same land, at least of Germany. That wasn't, in fact, also exactly because of the Habsburgic ambitions, not separated into different countries, but there was a kingdom of Germany, so that was also very important overall, as much as the fact that the Habsburgs would come to expand, in fact, into, mostly territorially speaking, mostly in two countries that were not German, such as, in fact, the Czech and the Hungarian lands, and beyond, by the way, up to Ruthenia, as we know. I made many videos about Galicia. So definitely the Austrians did care about being German. They recognized their Germanness. They were Germans, right? But of course, they also understood that their role as the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, at least being ruled directly by being the most central to the Habsburgic rule, conferred them some sort of greater honor and glory. It's difficult here to simply answer, at least concisely, given the time, to say the role that the same Austrian estates would have in trying to gain some autonomy for themselves, so aligning with other parts of Germany that did want to escape the Habsburgic push. This is absolutely normal, right? As much as there were, in fact, other faithful Germans but also Czechs, Hungarians, Italians that were working for the Habsburgs not to switch their center of power, so to de facto favoring a German power itself. So this is actually very important because there were other players in the scene as well. The World War I propaganda posters naturally tend to depict a more rosy idea of the fact that, I don't know, the Muslim Bosnians were treated so well in this empire. Was generally speaking Catholic mostly, and but not only. There were the Orthodox, there were the Calvinists still. So And there's no doubt that after 1867, what we're looking at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even more specifically, the Kaiserlich und Königlich, always remember that is basically not well. Let's say, speaking of health and general, say, stability, it's not done for, but in general, after 1867, the Hungarian prepotence, right, brings to not just of course, the jealousy of different other groups, and so to the further fostering of nationalistic instances, but in fact, clashes within the same system, because the moral of the story, everybody hates the Hungarians. This is like one of the few, permanent takes about European history, and there was somebody who liked them, but we're also not doing so just out of simple sympathy. There were always some sort of shady Machiavellian reason behind this. But jokes aside, there is actually, this connects very much with what you said at the beginning about nationalism, that truly changes a bit the picture. Like my general idea about the Habsburgic Empire, I also have Habsburgic subjects ancestry, and so it makes me think, of course, is that until Napoleon, more or less, like the Ancien regime had held to a degree, it didn't feel necessarily threatened, right, and did really work through that more universal and traditional outlook that especially the Habsburgs had sort of upheld up to that point, in part also because they were a bit more backwards than, in fact, more rampant powers that were much more nationalistic in a sense. And even Prussia would end up to be more rapaciously sort of nationally unifying in many ways. And in fact, the clashes, say especially like the secularization of the empire, was a great humiliation. Austria did not really emerge too well in the broader picture. The restoration was quite difficult for everybody involved, but definitely we know that the restoration could not halt the general process of eventual, say, disgregation of the empire. There's nothing deterministic about that, but considering how, say, the world was turning in general, it's obvious that the Habsburgic Empire was a bit of a complicated thing to keep together. And with the revolutions of the 19th century, you realize that the Habsburgs had already suffered again this the deprivation of their Holy Roman Imperial title, and that start having ever more muscular enemies and risk to get involved in wars that they do not want to fight. We've seen it also in the video about the War of Crimea, right? How the Austrians were behind, like, all the bigger movements, and they would not participate to the war, but they risked to get into that as well. Became a sort of ever more police regime to an extent. They had to control the various national movements of independence, and as an obvious measure, they became more oppressive, right? Now, regardless of how people think of this, depending on where they come from, there is probably a switch in the attitude, in the ideology. And paradoxically, even though the Habsburgic Lorrainese house would be the greatest proponent, at least, of a more so-called let's call it multicultural, multi-ethnic. I don't want to sound too liberal in that sense, but it's saying this sort of traditional sense of, again, there is an empire ruled by the Habsburgs, there is, generally speaking, a German core, but there are also these other nationalities that all play along because of the manifest, say, prestige and honor and glory of the great house of Habsburg, right? And so God preserved this empire, etc. And again, it came actually with a very powerful and seductive ideology and narrative, so that it's one of the most, in my opinion, fascinating empires in the history of mankind. Especially at this point, regardless of the Holy Roman Empire in general and the role of the Habsburgs in the early era. But the second part is as dramatic, as eventually fallimentary for them, but not less fascinating, right? What really fucked it all up, so to say, it was the embracing from the side of the Austrians as a people German nationalism and pan-Germanism even more to an extent. This is an incredibly delicate topic because it has something to do, maybe not with today, because we don't look at pan-nationalistic movements, if not maybe from Russia, again, that decides that everything is Russian, and so tries poorly to do something about it. This has to do, of course, with the broader development of the state of people, the industrialization. Oh, what changed during the 19th century? Probably the nation state as well, but more, right? Because these pan-ethnicistic movements were actually quite potent in many ways, and did fuel the same, for example, expansion of the Tsarist Empire, the same Prussian one, to turn, in fact, into Germany, right? Austria excluded, and that's actually the broader point, and that was actually the greatest issue. The Austrians began to sympathize with the Germanistic cause, which obviously was, generally speaking, fueling ethnic hatred against the other minorities of the empire. Say, we are objectively, as Austrians, the most advanced people. Actually, the most advanced people of the Habsburgic Empire were the Lombards, right? That's what was by far the most productive, at least, land. But like in this case, like you see, a people like the Austrians had managed to control even a richer one at some point. But let's say we are the best ones. In fact, that's also where, for example, in the 19th century, the negative concept towards the Italian happened, right? Up to the 18th century, most Italians abroad were very rich, educated, important people, right? In the 19th century, there's the mass migration for different reasons, including the Italian unification itself, but especially also in terms of these independentistic movements. What had previously been as relatively faithful subjects, I have some videos incoming on Montecuccoli, for example, that's literally saved Vienna before the siege of 1683. Now these peoples were starting to be seen through a nationalistic lens as anomalies, right? Something that had to be either repressed and or in certain cases also ethnically assimilated. And the Habsburgs began to work in that direction because in a way it was a race against time that they would ultimately lose, but at least they understood that they could save as much as they could. This is part of the reason why, for example, they followed, they actually started World War I, at least on their own terms. I'm not saying that was per se determinant, because even though there was a domino effect with all the game of alliances, intent, etc., let's say there was always a Germany, there was always a Britain, there was always a Russia, there was always a France, etc. But in many ways, that was a desperate gamble to hope to get something out of that. And you know that we've seen it in the video about the Strafexpedition, the Battle of the Altipiani, that basically the Austro-Hungarian command ends to be just basically an extension of the German one, because basically they couldn't organize the bigger plan anymore on their own. And I have a series that I want to continue about the Habsburgic Empire that would also talk more about this stuff. And so just to answer the question, it's not like actually the Habsburgs tried to maintain that concord between, that facade of concord between the various peoples, but they did themselves work to actually affirm ever more a German ethnic core, especially as others were actively challenging them through their own nationalistic movements. Again, mostly Hungary, as always, but also other peoples. And so this was a chain effect that to some extent even the dynasty had sort of limited impact. Things could definitely go in a different way, but we should also realize the inherent frailty of the system by that point, right? And so I wouldn't think that by the time just to answer the questions, by the time the German core was being ethnically exalted, this was much against the religious universal or dynastic rule of the system. Yes, there were movements that opposed that, but as long as the Habsburgs were still in charge and de facto carrying this thing out by itself, it didn't seem like an issue, right? To their own level, they had even been fairly liberal because they knew, in fact, they couldn't quite simply oppress everybody, if not like by triggering revolutions, etc. So that was the pious ideal, but also in practice, it was pretty desperate balance. And I would say that in the 19th, in the 20th century, whatever the religious universal and dynastic meaning, even in the very traditional Habsburgic Empire, was simply surpassed by the people that made up every system. All right, I often say that the Middle Ages ended in 1919 in some places in Europe, such as, in fact, Austria, Hungary at that point, Germany, Russia, etc. But this is not, it can be a compliment or not. It depends on who you're looking at for different reasons. But we're talking really about a time where tradition died in the masses. And I made a video review about Walpurgisnacht by Meyering that takes place in Prague during World War I, and it's, I would say, a very, very good, not just occult title, but also one that shows a bit was the impending feeling in an era like that, almost like a world that had arrived magically straight out of the Middle Ages, prepotently confronting with a brutal modernity that basically shatters everything in a moment in which humans came into question some of the fundamental principles of their own existence. So I would say that that's the main answer. Number 5, the Ottoman Empire. Just as many Islamic polities before them, the Ottomans seem to have conceptualized their state as the manifestation of Dar al-Islam. This is important to mention due to the fact that this empire in the modern day is perceived only by its Turkish identity. Yes, definitely I would say myself that at least the Turks have very much an idea of that, unsurprisingly, but also in this case, we will see now that it's actually more complicated than it seems, because who were the actual Turks, right? And so I would distinguish Turkic from Turkish, which is the easiest shortcut to sort of compromise these terms. In any case, going on with the question, not to mention the Ottomans seem to have balance between a trifecta of three identities: Khans of the Steppes, Emperors of the Romans, and Islamic sultans. This is extremely important. I really thank you for bringing that up, because it very neatly photographs what the Ottoman sultans really thought of themselves in descending order, in rising order of importance, I would say, in the list. You can even see these roots manifest today with Turkey's attempted inclusion in the EU, the supposed Turanist Union, all while claiming the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, it's not even a paradox. It's kind of just a normal continuity, and it wouldn't be strange at all. Continuing, but like the Holy Roman Empire, in brackets, Empire of Germans, which in this sense, at least as the dominant Germans, as we explained in the previous video, how valid would it have been to call the Ottoman Empire an empire of Turks? How important was Turkishness to Ottoman identity from the view of a common loyalist? How important was it to the ruling dynasty, were the Turks perceived as an ethnic core? So this is also interesting, given that we're talking mostly about the modern era, even though the most foundational part is definitely late medieval, and so in times where things were perceived in more traditional ways. I would say that also in this case, there actually is a Turkish core, if we understand it as Turkish and not Turkic, though, because my understanding of the rise of the Ottoman Empire is basically it emerged in an era that was historically European, right? Doesn't matter how sort of blended it had been as a frontier zone, but let's be honest, the Osmanian dynasty rose on the Marmara Sea, right? And those were areas that Europeans had controlled since ever, right? The Ottomans, in this sense, even more when compared with the Persians, with the Egyptians, they're most evidently a Western power. Right, and yet, of course, they aren't, in the sense that we understand Westernness, at least in a religious, moral, and cultural sense. I would say, especially as a military historian, that the Ottomans are Western from an Islamic perspective, if anything, from, in fact, a military point of view. Right, and this is, again, also debatable. It's more like a provocation. Very well again about the fact that the Ottomans tried to put together everything they could to legitimize their power, in part because they had such an enormous empire that stretched literally from Ukraine to Sudan and from Hungary to Oman, that we would have not done that would have been dumb. Turkishness did exist, however, like if we separate again the fact that, of course, the Ottomans have barely anything to do with Central Asians and probably the originary Turco-Mongol peoples, and that are more like just an Islamic creation in a moment of, say, expansion of surely a Turco-Mongol originary push of some sort, but mostly like the exploitation, let's say, of some mostly also desperate groups against a crumbling polity, like the Byzantine one, that also technically self-sabotages because they literally opened the gates to the Turks, right? So that's how it happened, to make the long story short. The Westerners were in control of the thing, but the Byzantines decided that this was too much, and so basically they opted for opening the gates to the Turks, which also explains how, of course, Anatolia was Turkish, so to say, whereas Rumelia was historically at least a group of peoples. It was this universal legacy of the Romans from the Byzantine bulk that we can identify as Greek, at least in the foundations at this point. And in fact, the Greeks would be sort of the most dynamic element within the Ottoman Empire, also in the Ottoman administration. It's very easy to see that the Ottoman Empire is just basically taking the place of the Byzantine one in a broader political and strategical sense in that part of the straits, like from there across 3 continents. In this sense, I think it's undeniable that the empire was Turkish, and that the Ottoman broader identity was nationally Turkish at large, right? The system, it's a bit like what we said about the Persians before. The system was run by people who spoke Turkish, who followed the sort of Islamic, in this sense, Turkish tradition. There was not an autochthonous one in the Balkans. And it pertained, in fact, to Anatolia, and in fact to areas that had historically struggled against the Byzantines for a very long time, even though they called themselves part of the Rum, of the sort of Rome. And that, in the sense, did not have any problem, in fact, to embrace the aforementioned imperial, universal notion that they were essentially a chosen group that ruled over other groups, right? So I wouldn't say that, let's say, also in this case, there was simply like, okay, being Turkish did not really simply matter, right? Just think about the Janissaries that were basically Turcified just by default, and they had actually a great compensation, so that the families in the early days were sort of terrorized, of course, by the much more brutal Turkish means, and later on, say in the 16th century, they began to send their children to actually be janissaries, because they would at some point come back and provide them with lands, etc. There is no doubt also that in this sense the Ottomans did enact a process of Islamization that was functional to that. There were also lots of Turks all around that could be simply settled, as it had been going on from a while. So from within by the Byzantines, we talked about the Cumans before. Those are a very good example of that. So the same Byzantine Empire had at some point accepted this sort of weird melange of settling everybody that could work for the empire, even as just labor force or manpower, regardless of their ethnic background, as long as they were outside Constantinople, they were outside the sort of the coastal Greek cities that would, however, profit from, of course, the exports of the interland that would be in fact populated by these peoples. So that's a bit like the bizarre combination of especially Greek culture historically since antiquity, right? Since the Hellenic polis and their colonies across the Mediterranean. So definitely I think that the Turks were perceived as the ethnic core, not just an ethnic core. They had come to dominate over other peoples. After all, there was also coming with the Turkic element historically the Islamic one as well. So there was a rigid religious hierarchy as well. Again, cooptation was all over the place. And the same Ottomans, in fact, the Osmanians as such, tended to keep, again, people down to foster, let's say, some communities that were also Christian, Jewish, to give more dynamism to the empire and to confer also this sort of more hierarchical control over a vast amount of peoples that, in fact, let's say the broader core of the empires, is Anatolia and Rumelia, right? The others were truly foreigners to a degree, even though you would find them in the Ottoman armies, etc. So what a common loyalist would be here, I don't picture exactly what it is, but considering that the bulk of the Ottoman army was constituted by the Sipahi and the Janissaries, I think also in that sense, as an empire, there's no doubt that this was a Turkish one, right? Even if in the Janissaries one, again, a Turcified Islamized element, but let's say in the Sipahis, in the most nobiliar core that you have to look at when especially you see that when you want to look at the most national element, you have to look at the aristocracies. If the aristocracies really represent themselves in a way, it's because in part they have come to fake it, to stress their own historical ethnic prerogatives. Think how strong oligarchic power was in Hungary, right? It's just because actually it paradoxically stemmed from the original lack of care towards a more unitary view. But since monarchic power had been increasing, also the nobiliar estate had to aggrandize itself and to act more unitarily, so to foster that national attitude, right? So also for the Ottomans, it's relatively tricky because of all those titles to think that they're just Turkish, but they really are. This is also pretty evident in also the various titles at court, etc., because at least Turkish is dominant. But also the nobility is Turkish, right? And it continues to cultivate that identity. So regardless of all the auxiliary subject peoples, yes, the Ottomans at large have the Turks at the top. And they are also conceived at different levels of Ottoman politics and society, the cornerstone of their domination, right? There isn't really another one. And then here we could digress further on how the Ottomans themselves were controlling what the same Byzantines had done through mostly a coastal dimension and how, but yes, there is that hierarchy nevertheless, because yes, the interland is less important and it's all about also this Ottoman capacity of projection and mostly stemmed from the control of the straits, but not only. Right, the interland is subjected, and so that's why it provides with resources. Question 6. post-Visigothic Christian kingdoms. The Visigoths had managed to build a society that balanced Gothic and Roman identity. Leovigild's reign and conversion to Latin Christianity seems to have also accelerated an assimilation process between the Goths and Romans. I'm sure you have addressed this in your video, how the Romans chose to become Germans, but I have to ask this question for two reasons. One, it's been a long time since I've seen the 2-hour-long video. Okay. Two, my main question regards the impact of the Moorish conquest on Iberian identity as opposed to a focus on the Latin-Germanic synthesis. So how entwined were the Romans and Goths between the period of Leovigild and the Moorish invasion, which are two different periods, by the way? How did the identity of the Romano-Iberian people evolve and differ between those under Muslim rule and Christian rule? At what point did they stop identifying themselves as Roman citizens? This is a very sort of... it's not really that they're difficult questions to answer. It's just like, this could be answered even without the Visigothic aspect of it. Let's say, if we talk about citizenry strictly meant, this had sort of long gone, all right? During antiquity, de facto, most people were colonists rather than citizens. In any case, Islamic rulers saw themselves as sovereigns over a subjugated Christian population, but was there a place of Roman identity in this? What happened to the Visigoth nobility who fell under the conquest of the Moors? Under the rule of the Christian kingdoms, how and when did the Iberian populations come to identify themselves by their respective kingdoms, I suppose, Galician, Castilian, Leonese? How did this contrast with the Basque kingdom of Navarre, Pamplona? How did the rulers of each... Okay, this starts being a bit too much. How did the rulers of each Christian kingdom classify the ethnic makeup of Iberian? How did religion intersect with this? How would these views have played into Alfonso VI's claim to emperor of two religions? Okay, so I will... These are too many questions at once. So I may even talk this stuff separately, but let's put it in this way. First of all, Islamic Iberia and also the Visigothic period at large are relatively shady compared to other parts of Europe. The reason being that in Roman times, the Hispano-Roman nobility had largely remained based on the latifundium. It was a tendentially, proto-feudal society already. So the average person did identify as Roman for a long time, probably also after the Visigothic conquest that was, as you know, something fairly slow. At least there were two major phases of takeover, and it's not like the Visigoths ever fully controlled the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, especially as say a direct rule. At some point they achieved that. In fact, under Leovigild, there is like the apotheosis, let's say, of royal power, at least in that full completion, like the resolution of in those generations, the resolution of the Gothic and of the Arian and the Catholic issues. Certain fringes of Spain, including some of the most developed, do not probably feel very Visigothic, and they are very strongly Roman, but they can feel both when there is a realization, like during the Moorish conquest, although they're both pretty autonomous and not in charge. So what paradoxically happens when the the Muslims take over is that actually a great part of what constituted the core of the Visigothic nobility really gets slaughtered in the process, right? And it's not like there were too many in general. So some managed to flee to the north. But what happens, for example, in the Ebro Valley is that Romanity that had always brought to uprisings against Toledo, etc., paradoxically turns to be Gothic. turns to say, okay, well, we are adopting ourselves like the notion that, yes, at some point we were under the Visigothic kingdom. This is true also for certain parts of southern Gaul. And that there is this trace of Gothic, in that sense also because they wanted to trigger the Franks in the north, frankly. But so it's a very complex thing, and especially in the early ages, it's very difficult because Islam, as you know, also manages to take over those places too at a point. They would always control them in a relatively decentralized ways, but up to Navarre, as we've seen in the videos that I made on the topic, there are Islamic cemeteries. There is an Islamic elite. So I have a colleague at university that say we was one of my colleagues when made a PhD, and now he teaches somewhere else in Madrid. So we have lost track of him, but he knows Spanish history, in fact, and he once told me at least that the main identity that came after the Islamic conquest wasn't much revolving around the Gothicness or the Romanity, for that matter, of that system. Also because, say, during the Visigothic era, there was a gradual, say, Germanization of identity, as you pointed out. I made a video on that very topic. Because at the end of the day, it was the Gothic kings who ruled, or at least the Hispano-Visigothic nobility that came from the Visigothic establishment, at least of power. There had been some Romans who had tried to blockade the Pyrenees to prevent a Gothic takeover, but those days were over. They had lost themselves. So there's a lot into it, like for example, the imitation of Constantinople by Toledo in a sort of different path taken from Rome. In fact, had Visigoths continued, probably they would have not really been too aligned with Rome necessarily, at least for another while. The way the Visigothic kingdom crumbled, frankly, does not have to do much with, in fact, how the Goths and the Romans had blended, but it definitely spoke of a system that was very much privatized. It did not have much of a unitary outlook when properly, like, speaking of administration at the local level. And so things were gradually changing towards something more unitary, but also the rest of Spanish history, as you know, after the Reconquista as well, was pretty messy, right? And that's also the reason why the Moors remained so long in the Iberian Peninsula, because the Christians were fighting against one another rather than really thinking of expelling, but were at that point subjects, as you also pointed out, from Alfonso VI's claim to emperor of the three religions as well, because there were the Jews involved, and lots of them in Spain. It also sided with the Moors, because the Visigoths had by far the most repressive policy against the Jews in the entire Romano-Germanic world. So what I was saying before is that, as opposed to a truly Gothic legacy, there is a sense of a Christian identity during the Reconquista that's really preponderant, right? And there is an understanding that, of course, there is this broader Romance place that once had been Visigothic as well. Mostly during the Renaissance, the Spanish began to recover a bit that classical mythology, so to say, for their own people. But when you look at the Reconquista system, you realize that it's just really the North that remains in charge, that the nobility that takes over the South is truly like destroying the previous government, right? So that the local establishment does not disappear, but there is truly like an imperial ethos, especially from Castile. So when we look, I made videos about Galicia, Castilla, Leon, and you see how they emerge from relatively petty realities. Like they had mechanisms and identities really tied to their own provincial things in the north that barely had anything to do with, at some point at least, with a comprehensive look of that Gothic Roman past just per se, right? Indeed, they come to take over a system which was not foreign, also because during the same Moorish domination, the Christian northerners were employed as mercenaries. They pillaged far and wide up to Andalusia, so they understood that this was their world. But the Iberian Peninsula is really huge, it's really diverse in climate, in terrain. You can see how, in fact, the different countries developed, really, like with really on the Mediterranean coast, the Ebro Valley. It's really a very different culture, mentality, and even language to a degree. Castile is another thing. It's mostly a continental one. Portugal manages to clamorously, as martially, emancipate itself from what had been essentially a Castilian rule. And so you see these different nationalities emerging without much of a memory of the at least of a institutional informal footprint of the Hispano-Visigothic formal identification, right? So too much really had passed, right? And so I'm reading here the various questions, how they came. This is really too complicated. Of course, the Northerners thought themselves fully as Christians, and to them, again, this was the single most important thing. And so they took over imperially wise these other peoples. Alfonso VI from Toledo really could and would and must boast the fact that he was there to control from the cornerstone of the Meseta, the entire sort of Iberian region, because that had been the center of Spain. This was also to further consolidate as such, and he could not renounce to the support of the Mudejares, so the Jews and the Muslims, that only in the later Middle Ages began to basically see their rights restricted. So it's an incredibly complicated picture, so to say, and basically, like about the previous period, yes, more or less, the Iberian Peninsula was loosely understanding that, like in the rest of the West, that the rulers were Germanic, and so that by transient dynamic, they were themselves basically part of that the seigneurial system that stemmed from the Germanic power. So again, this would, I made so many videos on the topic. You can check this for Gaul, for Italy, for other places that at some point considered themselves Germanic, even though they were Romans. All right, this happened more or less in the same way in the Iberian Peninsula, however, with more loosely. Right. Also, the Visigothic code that you mentioned before very often is. You didn't mention that, but it's part of the game, so to say. Is very often connected with Spain, the Lex Romana Visigotorum, and so there is this notion that look at how sort of advanced and functionally developed sort of late antique and early medieval Spain had become with this integration of Romans and Goths. Most of that was actually Ostrogothic legislation that they took from Italy and they basically adopted to make things work. The society had fairly degraded, especially this would happen from the second half of the 6th century, so that paradoxically, even the crisis favors the compaction of a more neatly recognized Visigothic monarchy. There is the crashing of different rebellions in the fringe, etc., but as we know, paradoxically, the same Northerners that they would lead the Reconquista were the guys who had been fighting against the Goths, which is sort of paradoxical, but quite relevant in the picture. So by Alfonso VI, there was a Christian ruler that said, I will protect everybody because I'm basically the emperor of Spain. There's probably a title, in fact, that you mentioned here, that it was proper also of other peoples. The Anglo-Saxons even used it at some point. Basileus, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon king, actually came up with, interestingly enough. And so there was surely an imperial sense of grandeur inherited from the Emirate of Cordoba, later the Caliphate. I talked about this too from an Islamic perspective. There had been, of course, a broader Roman legacy, but a bit too much of a distant one at a point to be properly felt in relation with the Byzantines. Like the Germans, the Italians had to do with the Byzantines, the Spanish basically not. For a long time, they were properly too distant. They were in contact, but there wasn't much to... There was an imperial sense from Spain, especially from Castile later on, of broader hegemony over the entirety of the peninsula. We're in the 13th century, and even in North Africa. But eventually the mid-14th century crisis cut things short and sort of regionalized and nationalized further the Iberian kingdoms. So it's all very complicated, right? And the various provincial identities in the north, they're more highlighted also because they are, the ones from which the Reconquista stemmed and were also fairly more documented about because they were Christian. And from the Arab side, we don't know really much, really. And we understand that we're also fairly simple societies, right? Very warlike, not even fully feudalized. They also later maintained at the peak of feudalism in Europe, like their own specificities. They lagged behind a bit in the modernization of their armies in the later Middle Ages until the 100 Years' War. So and still, like, the Iberian Peninsula is a bit isolated. And so there is actually an horizon of universal power over the region, but because this is so different and diverse. And so nothing strange that different valleys, different places, areas in general, had sort of different identities in the north that we also come to know better, right? The Arabs ruled in a bit of more, Persian Byzantine fashion, so with sort of tendentially more centralized system, big state, big bureaucracy, permanent army, that however at some point dries up. It mostly revolves around Andalusia. That was also the most Romanized part of the system, that however does not seem under Islam to have boasted any particular Romanity. I mean, I'm sure that there may have been a continuation of that, but it was truly of another mold, right? We could have said it for the Ottoman Empire because they could call themselves emperors of the Romans, but of course it was a title mostly used for convenience. It's not like they cared so much themselves about identifying as Romans as much as, say, the Byzantines had done, because they objectively had been the continuation of the previous Roman state, right? One thing is imitation by saying, look, we are the same guys that existed here before. This is also what Alfonso VI actually does. Another thing is properly like the mold that you come from, and so that's a bit more national in nature. And the northern Iberian powers were also increasingly influenced by the Frankish world, by the papacy, that manages to actually eliminate the Visigothic right that they had maintained in the north, but not much because they were Visigothic, but because they were Iberian. It was the one that had universally existed. And the papacy did obtain in exchange for military help during the Reconquista as well. So it's a very interesting history. Number 7, Capetian France. My previous prompt about France was quite vague, because we discussed this in the previous video as well. So now I will attempt to frame this subject more precisely. Between the local cultures of Normans, Bretons, Occitanians, and the north of France, it is still difficult for me to conceptualize that France had a concrete national identity in the Middle Ages. That's because basically I answered him in the previous video that France had a pretty, uncontroversially fully fledged national identity as a kingdom and as a dominion in general, especially in the north. So the question continues. It says, how did French evolve from being a phrase synonymous with Romans under Charlemagne? Not quite, honestly. We'll talk about this now. Into a distinct and separate identity under the Capetians. So let's put it this way: the Franks, in this case in Neustria, mostly. Neustria and Austrasia were part of the kingdom of the Franks, so that the people who inhabited there considered themselves Frankish. All right, just like as we explained now, the Iberians would call themselves Visigothic, the Italians would call themselves Longobards, and they were also known abroad for that. And consider always that the Iberian Peninsula was a bit more isolated, but say especially France, Italy were very much interconnected in ways that were literally axiomatic in Western civilization. So also these national identities were not so vague to begin with. So the fact that because here he wrote Frank/French evolved from being a phrase synonymous with Romans under Charlemagne. Not quite, because first of all, the same Carolingians were Germanic, and okay, but for example, Austrasia, as the kingdom of the early and in part also high medieval kingdom of the Franks, was also part of this kingdom. It was Germanic. So Neustria, of course, was Romance at large and juridically Frankish, though. So it's not much like Charlemagne that makes France per se, because at the time of Charlemagne, in that sense, France did not exist. Right, it was mostly like the kingdom of the Franks at large as a broader identity. It's mostly like in the late Carolingian period that as you know, in the Oaths of Strasbourg, etc., that sense of national division emerges between the Eastern and Western Franks that are not even just Neustria and Austrasia, and that also in other countries like what would become Germany, for example, a Teutonic identity begins to be worked out, especially from the scriptoria of Reichenau, St. Gallen. It's also as a relatively monastic creation, or at least one that we can document from that milieu, right? We talked about this also in the videos about the video commentary, Kings and Generals, about the Germans and so on. And also in the previous video, question and answer of this thing. So, in this sense, it's not like the Capetians came to determine the French either, right? There was a Western Frankish world already before the Capetians that mostly stemmed from the divisions of the partitions of the Carolingian Empire, and that again mostly existed in continuity with the Neustrian world, that I would like to stress, by the way, was the most important part of the empire. I mean, the actual manpower and the actual wealth of the Carolingians was in Neustria, all right? Regardless of the fact that the Carolingians emerged from Cologne, so the Germanic part of the Isle, so to say, of the Frankish kingdom. But really the bulk of power, if you wanted to rule the Franks, you had to rule from Neustria, already from more or less Paris and the surroundings. Paris is not immediately the capital, right? But it's already a very important center. I also made a video about medieval Paris. So again, it's not much the Capetians just to make France. They are the ones, as you know, under Philip Augustus, that call the switch from, the title of kingdom of the Western Franks in Latin to literally Royaume de France, so literally the kingdom of France in French, by the way, already by the early 13th century. So this is something really, even before they took over the south, interestingly enough. And this is not because the Western Frankish kingdom, as you know, existed. Even Catalonia was part of the Western Frankish kingdom, and everything pretty much like Brittany was excluded in theory because it was really more ambiguous land that just even in a fully international formal sense would be incorporated into the Kingdom of France in the Renaissance, even in the 16th century. But that's also a relatively marginal reality. So France, in this sense, already existed, right? And if we are talking about the South, given that you mentioned the Occitanians, it's not like the Occitanians, but in this sense, if you understand them as a different nation, they would continue to be a different nation for a very long time, right? Ruled over by a very powerful and very big and very strong French North that, again, by sort of regional standards, is already a fully fledged national thing, right? It's a country, it's a kingdom, it's the center of an empire, because it's from this place that the Franks had been ruling the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, that all. And it's interesting how, for example, the Burgundians in part had been assimilated into the Frankish world already, but it's points of becoming French to a degree. This is already true by the time of Charlemagne, roughly, because there are different parts also in the south with Provence, with the Rhone, the Rhone River, the Rhone Valley, etc., that remain a bit more Burgundian. The Kingdom of Arles, I made videos about that too, but from the continental part, objectively, there's not even a boundary, right? It's as if the Gallia Belgica had been replicated in that sense. There's also some kind of ambiguity regarding to the east. You can't follow the, say, the linguistic divide. Think about the Walloons and the Flemish. However, what is France already by the time, say, of Charles the Simple, Hugh Capet, is especially the latter. And so, yes, you can argue that this was France at that point, under the Capetians, starting from the Capetians, but it's already something that existed in the wake of Latinly meant national identity. It's like saying, Lombardy. You can equate it to Italy to an extent. It's a bit the same thing. It's also, in part, what happens still within Spain to some extent. It's even if we don't have much of the Visigothic continuation, but the pool is broadly speaking the same. This can be said of the Anglo-Saxons. I understand here that you say there are different chunks here that look different, but let's take this bit better into consideration, because again, northern France is also pretty big. Like Austria, it's big. Like it has also pretty important centers. It has major rivers. It's very powerful and properly coriaceous as an entity, right? So not to say that there is a very strong political cohesion at the root of it that also underscores like a national identity. So, again, I never claimed, also in the previous video, that the Occitanians were French. In fact, they aren't. They're truly another nation. Like, I don't know, Italy as a whole is sort of much more Italian than France is. Say, Occitania is French historically, right? We tend to underestimate this kind of aspects. There are different degrees to this. You can argue that Occitania continues well into the Iberian Peninsula to some extent. And so that there is the divide there between Catalonia and eventually how there you see the superimposition of the Aragonese or kingdom with de facto a Catalonian nation. And so it's the degree of difference with the comparison of one another that you can understand how powerful these identities are. And in fact, exactly because the Occitanians are not French, you can understand that there was a very strong French national identity already by the time that happened. So what's the point of making this is the broader misunderstanding. The fact that today we see Occitania as largely France, southern France, what we call southern France as France, does not mean that it wasn't a French national identity before those territories were taken over by France and franchised, how you want to call it, Frenchified, whatever. The Bretons are frankly negligible in the bigger picture. The Normans also, I wouldn't count them as something different from the Western Frankish kingdom / France. And I will explain now why actually in the following question, because we talk about the Normans, right? But Normandy is pretty univocally Western Frankish. Politically it does something else, as I don't know, Burgundy does something else, but say that there is nothing specifically non-French about it. We will understand now why. So the following question, how was French culture disseminated to each aforementioned identity? Again, France was France. The land of the Franks, it was basically the size of a national chunk. Like you could see Lombardy, like you could see Alemannia, like you could see Bavaria. And the Eastern Frankish part eventually would become a bigger nation, and we know that Germany was more fragmented. So, but especially Gaul and Italy had this pretty early sort of outlooks of what was the hegemonic element in them, right, and what kind of ramifications this could have. The Loire was the boundary. Like in the south, it was de facto Occitania, or barely. Like there is also a central part of France that is something slightly different from the southernmost part. So also in that case, it goes by degrees. And actually, the French advance from the north throughout that, across the Loire, even to an extent. But half Gaul is massive. So if we realize that half of it is truly Frankish and later Western Frankish and thus French, it's already a pretty big thing. Then how, the question goes on, how strongly did these cultures feel the need to distance themselves from being French in order to maintain cultural and political autonomy? Well, much. The Occitanians basically bailed out of the recognition of Hugh Capet as king. They stopped literally counting their years as on the basis of the kings. This is very interesting because up to that point in the south of France, since Carolingian times, the years had been calculated like that. So they had technically recognized whoever was in charge, in fact, namely the previous Carolingians and the later ones up to the 10th century, as kings, as rightful things. Hugh Capet rises to power in a relatively debatable fashion that was basically the legal excuse for these peoples to say, okay, we don't care, also because you can't come rule over here. So they had actually a pretty strong interest in doing so. There had been Visigothic, Burgundian influences, so those were the chunks of the Frankish Empire that had been previously other people, and so that difference already existed. The Bretons are basically not much in the bigger picture, right? And that's also why they remain isolated, and they didn't even need to specifically stress a difference from French culture because they already were Celtic. They were truly something else also in lives. And the proof is also the fact that they were close to France, but France did not have as much interest in Brittany as it had towards the south, for example, because it was more civilized. Continuing the question, how enthusiastic were they so these, basically the Normans, Bretons, and Occitanians, in the need to adopt being French to gain cultural and political legitimacy? They were taken over. Except the Normans, they were French. The Normans were fully fledged French, Western Frankish people. They had nothing about being Scandinavian or Norse being different from the French. They were totally Western Frankish, if not like in genetics to some extent, right? So if France, the question goes on, if France had a unitary culture, why did nationalists of the French Revolution, those thereafter, feel the need to erase these identities and make them one? If France had a unitary culture, why did nationalists of the French Revolution and those thereafter feel the need to erase those identities? Well, simply because they were peripheral. It's just like saying, there was an Austrian identity and they wanted to gradually, they didn't succeed, but they wanted to further become ever more important and expand further. Again, I don't see it was a pretty solid French identity ever since. It's not like if this is the point, it's not like if what contemporary countries chunks of land once were not nationally belonging to the hegemonic one. It's like the hegemonic one wasn't fully fledged as a regional national country since practically the time of Clovis, right? This is very important. Why would there have been such a struggle? And by the way, the French Revolution was, I would add on top of that regardless of the ideological implication, was actually the triumph of a real state that was French in nature. Right, so France is gloriously a nation exactly because it managed to compact itself with an unprecedented force in Europe, exactly stemming from the French national court that managed to absorb and conquer and make French all these surrounding people. So I think it's very powerful in that sense. That this can be said about other nationalistic movements, separatistic movements in other areas, like Britain had the same, Spain had the same. So again, why is this question about France specifically? Again, it's pretty solidly national in nature. Is that you could make the same point for other cultures. I don't know, about Wales or about other minorities elsewhere in Europe. But, and finally, why would there have been such a struggle by local cultures to cling onto their local identities if such national identity existed? Well, because they were exactly fighting against that country that had that national identity that eventually took them over. So that national identity exists. Again, it's approximable with most of Gaul at the time, and it succeeded also because of that. All right, and it also because it had solid fundamentals since the beginning. Otherwise, again, it would have failed, because if there was a country that could easily fail in Europe, given how big it is and how unitary it struggled to be, it's exactly France. Because they always had this habit of, as a nation, to control other nations around. And they clamorously succeeded against these. And in fact, here we get to the point of the Normans. The Normans, by the way, didn't have the struggle. Like, I wouldn't include them among. The Bretons are, again, negligible. It's like, again, they could, at the end of the day, easily be taken over. It was more like the presence of other powers, like mostly the English, that prevented the French just to simply enter Brittany. Also because, yes, it was very, especially for the Renaissance, were quite interesting, but at that time it was a civilized place. But in previous times, it was, let's say, the proof being so close to France but not being taken over. It's not like there is a desperate struggle to take it over, right? The French do it fairly well, and even when there are the rebellions around it, they take it over once again, as we just observed. So 8, Norman England. The Normans were a Christianized and Frankified population of Scandinavians. This is where I disagree in the sense that the original so-called Normans were the Norsemen, but they were really a minority in what would be called Normandy. It is essentially the lower Seine basin, right? They were installed a bit. It's similar to what we see, for example, in I wouldn't say like the same thing, but Varangians in Eastern Europe, right? It's not like the Eastern Europe becomes, or parts of it become Norse, right? This is the same, even more the case in Western in the Western Frankish kingdom, because these are also more developed places. There isn't actually too much in the lower Seine basin before the High Middle Ages. In fact, also the same local Duchy of Normandy contributions, but this Duchy of Normandy is identically Western Frankish, so French. Like, there is no struggle between the two things, if not for political feudal reasons, not more than the ones that could have been between Burgundy and the Ile-de-France in a general sense. So that's still French, right? So here we're talking Norman England, I know, but if we're talking the Normans, given that they were coming at that point from Normandy, these were fully fledged Western Franks in everything. Language, military culture, administration, everything. They just had a bit more of Scandinavian genes, in them. But the wide majority of the so-called Normans by that point were a Romance people. And this is valid also for the Normans of southern Italy. That actually is a synecdoche for saying people coming from actual Normandy, but also other parts of Gaul, Germany, Italy, and so really a synecdoche. Mostly French, however, in language and script, in military engineering, and so that is the case, in fact, for the Haute-Ville in southern Italy. And this is the same case of the House of Normandy in England. They are French, all right? They're not Scandinavians, per se. And this is important as far as the national aspect of it is involved, because it shows how preponderant, in fact, that national background really was in a part like northern Gaul, in now a Frankish fashion. In a even more narrowly at this point Western Frankish, but still basically what became French. We had already become French if we want to approximate. And in fact, yes, it's correct. The part that you say here, like, we're subsuming to the fabric of French culture. All right. So, but it's important to distinguish them from, given that we're talking England here. And in fact, they later established a hegemony over England and joined cultures with the Anglo-Saxons. I like how you say joined cultures, because they basically, they actually were invited. It was the southeast of England, the most developed, that, okay, we want the Normans because they're tougher, they connect us better to the south. The Midlanders were not that happy. The herring of the north was hardly joining culture. It was pretty bloody mess. But you're right, of course, in a way that warfare hybridizes when it doesn't completely destroy, of course. So going on with the question, initially, there would have been a distinct division between the Anglo-Saxons and Normans. So as I asked before, how did the Anglo-Saxons transition from being subjects to self-identifying members of a political community? When and how did the Anglo-Normans see themselves as English? All right, so this happened in different stages, of course. At the beginning, there wasn't such a problem in the sense that the Anglo-Saxons had always been subjects of some ruler, including at this point a king of England, or better, king of the English. You had already Danish rulers, as you know, as kings of England. Knut the Great was actually a pretty competent king of England, well connected with Rome and etc. So the Anglo-Saxons, given their common law, which was also the norm at the time for other countries, did already self-identify as members of a political community, because in theory the ruler was there just to basically respect their own God-given natural law, right? At least that's a way of seeing it. And of course the rulers would try to consider themselves a bit more in charge, as you know, including the Normans for that matter. So there isn't really that shift. Right, the Anglo-Saxon kept existing, as you noticed, during the Norman period, in government, in posts, in administration. So it's that's it, right? There isn't. I hear if you say again, how did the Anglo-Saxons transition from being subject to self-identifying members of a political community? That they had always been, and that's basically the deals of other peoples. That's not unique to the Anglo-Saxons. Then when and how did the Anglo-Normans see themselves as English? This is a bit more complicated, because for a long time, of course, the ruling class considered itself French, all right, and they really saw it in a very imperial sense, just the same imperial way that I was mentioning before. And they spoke French. They were all French in that broader identity. So saying Anglo-Normans, of course, here I understand it refers to the identification of the Kingdom of England in the broader period, plus evidently not the Normans of Normandy, actually. And so the Anglo-Saxons always considered themselves English, right? And just they had a ruler that was French, but it was also in this sense the guy who had been called to rule over the English. We can say that essentially by the later Middle Ages, mostly it seems that it's debatable to an extent, but essentially the 15th century in many ways was the greatest process of Anglicization. There were different steps. Mostly all the time the English kings were defeated on the continent. There was a re-Anglicization or even a re-Britannicization of English power, right? We've seen it well in the videos about Edward I and Henry III, and we'll have to see it much better for the 15th century, right? So, but French culture is also something that goes very much on in many aspects of the English court for a long time. Concluding the question, how did the Normans balance their Norse, French, and English identity? Did one take precedence over the other? How did this evolve over time? So again, by the time of the conquest of England, given that we're talking Norman England, as I said, nobody really thought of the Normans as the Norse. Also because different countries now existed proper, like Norway was Norway, Denmark was Denmark, and the Duchy of Normandy was a Western Frankish thing. So the Norman conquerors as Frenchmen would be considered superior to the Anglo-Saxons, that to some extent were really more primitive and rougher, but we shouldn't exaggerate that because actually they had a pretty advanced administration, and without that the Normans would have also not succeeded to rule the country so effectively at a point. There has been recently a sort of more sobering revision of the administrative accomplishments of the Normans, because the idea is that they arrived, they established castles in stone that brought all the most advanced stuff. Okay, but we're still talking Northern Europe. It's still pretty difficult. It's not, again, that France and England are so different, after all, from one another. Especially, there are different shades within the same countries. They're relatively similar. There's no doubt, however, that the Normans were there to stay, and they succeeded in fully taking over. Right, so... of course, did one of these national identities take precedence over the other? Yes, by hierarchical, by the role of the elites, the one of the estates. So, in informal ways as well, because of course the Normans married into the Anglo-Saxons. So. There was a process of assimilation there, but in general, like Western Frankish society was so elitistic that, unlike the Anglo-Saxon one, that while bringing more order, also detached a bit the elite from the rest of the people. And the elite was French, and so there was a mark there of superiority in many ways. There were also Bretons and Flemish in that. You could have used, this is the point, the Flemish, instead of the Normans before, because the Flemish did end up under the Western Frankish rule, and the Flemish were at large at most in the Western Frankish kingdom, but of course they weren't French in the way we intend them, the Romance division. So let's assume we switch the Normans with the Flemish, and so the previous question was perfect in logical line, aside from of course the way I explain again what I meant, of course, by French nationality already existing. That I think that is very important, honestly. From the first question, I thought it was important to stress. So yeah, how did this evolve over time? We said it. Basically, there was a further process of Anglicization the more time went on, and that homogenized the Englishness of the country and its kings, even though, as we know, the English at some point would also call foreign dynasties once again, but that's also a moment of upper hand, probably of Englishness, given that the kingdom is the strongest around and can afford this kind of switches without losing independence, of course. Unlike what happened under the... you can't even say, what is independence, you see? It's not like the Normans destroyed, again, the Englishness of the Anglo-Saxons. No, as we just said, they came to lord over them, which is also basically the way these things go, dynastically speaking. They do it with the iron fist, and so there is actually... But this is because the decisive moral majority of the English that is concentrated in the southeast wants this. And so the others pay for and they pay for a long time. They don't take over relatively smoothly like in Sicily. There are wars that go on for decades in the north that are some of the single most brutal chapters in the history of high medieval Europe. Ninth question. This is big and sorry, I'm very exhausted for different reasons today, but this question was very, very long and I wanted to cover it. 9. Israelite Empire of Solomon. So already for this, there is a debate whether this was an empire or not. It's difficult to claim that, right? It was more like a provincial reality that incorporated surrounding, cultures with different religions and ethnicity. But let's read the question. Under the reign of King David, Israel was a small homogeneous state which exhibited a high degree of ethnic consciousness. Under King Solomon, this polity evolved into a multicultural and religiously diverse empire. And so again, it's maybe too contrasted, right? But let's take it as an approximation. The religious aspect of this state is quite intriguing to me. Biblical narratives seem to illustrate that God exalted the Israelites as a nation which would exert universal sovereignty under a single faith. You have stated once before that the Bible is polytheistic, but I didn't say that the Bible is polytheistic. First of all, I don't believe in polytheism in the sense that I think it never existed, historically speaking. But there were different ways to the worshipping of the only God that is not just passing through the only, the monotheistic concept that we have of it. And of course, in the Old Testament, it's full of these references to practices, to and rites and sacrifices to different polities, also from the side of now what should have been, in fact, allegedly the monotheistic Jews that, again, weren't polytheistic either, right? Okay, let's erase monotheistic and polytheistic because it doesn't help anything in history of religion. In any case, going on, so again, to me, the Bible is not polytheistic. In any case, you have stated once before that, which I can understand fits into the idea of an ecumenical rule. Well, not in that sense. At least not much in this case, meaning that you would have different nations, just for the sake of the topic, had different deities on their own. But because they interpreted essentially certain elements of the world in different terms, they didn't deny the existence of a broader divine power that was the ultimate one and the God Father. At least also among the mostly at this point virile dominated cultures, right? Not a great civilization of the mother, right? It is another thing. In fact, the question says there seems also to be a strong theme of monotheism and rejection of foreign gods. Obviously, we're talking the Bible. So as such, Solomon's attempt to rule such a diverse empire, being swayed by Gentile women, caused him to worship foreign deities. I'm reading from the question. Of course, this would have allowed him to uphold a universal state, but it's at the same time rejected in Scripture in favor of monotheism. If the Bible upholds the universal rule of Israel, why would it forbid the incorporation of foreign gods like that of the Greek and the Romans had done? So that is a good question. What else? What I wanted to say here? Yes, the fact that Solomon's sort of concessions to other deities is not much. First of all, it's filtered. It's not like we actually know what happened under King Solomon. We have to interpret greater say, a broader criticism that was fixed in the Bible against the rule of a king who was forced, or at least was capable also, depending on how you want to see it, to content different groups and showing respect towards different rites and cults and so on, in order to maintain control on these peoples, would stick as, bad from the perspective of a people that had deeply understood the necessity of a more totalizing sense of divine order, and so one that could keep better together people like the Jews, that were, in that sense, actually more compact, as you pointed out, even during Solomon, and that risked, once again, annihilation, deportation, conquest, etc., which never faded as a threat, right? So that is extremely important, that the stressing of the unity of religion into an absolute force that must not know any sort of, even conceptually, any degeneration, is quite important. The Greeks and Romans had behaved differently, not because they had necessarily a less totalizing sense of the ultimate God, but because they themselves at some point were either more lax and or they came to rule over other peoples that they really had to control in ways that the Jews never were able to do, because again they had most like a provincial, not even a regional power. So what the Greeks and the Romans were doing was being exposed more to these cultures and seemingly being more tolerant or whatever, but actually subscribing to the same notion of the existence of an actual unitary God, which is something I often explain in my videos, to the degree that I think it's become a meme of some sort for the channel, at least those who follow it routinely. Right, so that's basically the reason. It's just like the scope of actual Jewish control and power, which was pretty limited at this point compared to what especially Alexander the Romans really did. Right, so I don't know. Also, the Dorians initially had a much more unitary sense of God from the original geometric, like spiritualism of the Indo-Aryan conquerors, but things change for different reasons. The same is true also for Rome. So it's not polytheism. It's actually acknowledging that these forces are all part of the same God that in the fallen element of the world has taken that kind of shape, and that the purpose of these Catholic empires is to bring back into one. So actually this would have not been different from the purpose of Solomon if we accept the whole story as properly a mirror of this, right? So I would really point this out. And finally, we ended. And the message concludes with, lastly, if you have made it this far, I have one final burning set of questions regarding ethnic identity in the Middle Ages and Antiquity. But to keep this message simple, I shall leave it for another day until you have decided that this message and the one to follow are worth discussing. Regards, a fan. So, well, thank you very much for the questions. They're very enjoyable to answer. I like them. I understand, I understand the struggle. I think you are really trying to understand in a way that makes sense for you. In my opinion, the broader point is assessing, which is not easy to do, because say I used to think more or less like you did, technically, conceptually, when to me you have, by the way, pretty solid historical notions. I wanted to point out, you're not like a random learner. You do know things, and you know them in a very orderly fashion, so that it was not really like me entirely. I wonder really why, given the compactness of your knowledge, you still find yourself here, as you write yourself, genuinely, maybe you're being modest, but let's say genuine curiosity and confusion. You're generally curious and confused about this because I don't think it's so. I understand it requires a specific step further, but again, you already have an advanced historical knowledge, and it should be fairly easy to grasp the centrality of the nation together with the centrality of universalism, of faith, of dynasty, as a complementary part of the wall, right? It may be that as a military historian, you were acknowledging the fact that I talk more about military history, you see this more like anthropology. I don't know what's your background, honestly, and I'm curious about it. But it may be that as a military historian, to me, it's maybe easier to see, because this is really how I think history, like in terms of actual power. It's not much how they represented themselves or how they felt or they thought, because at some point we just don't know. And the actual macroscopic evidence that we have to understand that, though, is how these things stuck together, right? So in that sense, you may be more or less accurate in the assessment of which power was what or whatever, and you generally speaking get it. I don't think you even need such a great explanation. But it may be that not essentially visualizing the strategic needs for a political and territorial control may make you wonder about how this dominion stood on its feet. And to an extent, it is a historical mystery because, as I was saying since the beginning, for the Persians, it's not like we have a clamorous declaration about the racial superiority of the Persians as the God-chosen people to spread the heavenly glory over the world. We know pretty much, for example, comparative history of religions, that this is pretty much what they thought, that the entire thing is the Ravenna. So we will talk about this surely in some videos that will clarify it. I would say the videos about history of religion really may help too, because they show you how they actually saw power and how this power was not just a fixed title, right? There may be in your question some slight modernistic issue. You remember with France what you said also a bit with Hungary, because you told that you thought this at the beginning, like if you appreciate the strategic dimension of this, you can appreciate also how more malleable these dominions were, right? How not just they would change from the within, but also how they really came to encompass the geographical realities that they did, right? So with France, I think it's the most interesting part, because you seem to reason as if French identity did not exist because national identity did not exist because like parts of today's France, geographical France, were not French at the time, because there were actually other peoples in those, and that can't be a contrast with the existence of a French system that took it over. So we did that otherwise. And so with the same thing of Hungary, there are people who think that may happen since ancient history, like the existence of a nation. Of course, it can't be. I wouldn't dismiss, of course, any kind of longer continuity of some cultures, of some traditions, whatever, about which also we know a few. But we kind of, through military history, you come to know pretty well when a power is properly founded and established and is ruling and lording over others, which, imperially speaking, shows you very well when a nation rules over others. And it's even able to mold it as well, like create and expand and even nationalize others in its own image, right? So this set of questions was actually pretty interesting, pretty good, and I liked to answer them. It was very long. I would ask you to be sort of, you like this, it's okay, but say, if anything, not too many questions in one, unless you really feel the urge to explain in depth what you mean. And so that's more like rather than more questions, you could simply create, for example, I know it's more challenging with creating a sort of a deeper, bigger, complex thought that may also lead yourself to the answer, conceptually speaking, because that's also how it happens. It's not much just about getting more info together, but also at some point managing to sort it out, which I hope these questions are, these answers of mine have, generally speaking, done. Right? To me, it's important actually to talk this topic. You shouldn't think that as a military historian I don't want to answer them. I think actually these are the ones that make the channel grow. So the more this is of course something I tell to everybody. If you have such questions, if you have these ideas, as long as they are so well articulated, just please provide them. Right here I see that I'm about to exceed the broader length available for the video, so I will stop it here, because at least the way I elaborate the stuff online comes to a limit itself. So this tells me it's time. And again, I'm open to this kind of conversations. I will probably not. It depends. Not answer the third question, but if it is the last, we will conclude this cycle. But of course, any kind of question that I think it's good enough can be answered in the series. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.